and it's my pleasure to chair and respond to this first panel, What About the Facts? The way I'm going to handle this is I have a brief introduction that I'm going to read, and I don't need to introduce the speakers since, as was just mentioned, their bios are printed and you can look those up at your leisure. But I will let them each speak one by one, and then I have a short response to read at the end, and at that point I will open up the floor for comments and discussion, and I hope there will be some lively discussion afterward, but please hold your thoughts until everybody has spoken. This panel originated in a little venting I did on this group's Facebook page at the end of last fall semester. My course evaluations were in, and several students had complained about my use of PowerPoint. My slideshows, they said, were minimal, if at all. They gave no indication of what students needed to know for exams. Further, my quiz questions were ridiculously difficult. I expected them to remember impossibly obscure things like the fact that Puccini wrote Verismo operas. These comments were reflected in their test scores. For years, I had noticed that students consistently got their lowest scores on the completely objective portions of my exams, corresponding to the lowest levels of Bloom's taxonomy, those that required them to remember facts. Last year, those scores were lower than ever. I admit that when I first started teaching, I questioned whether those sections of exams were even needed. For me, as an undergraduate at Oberlin, a typical college exam had consisted of 2 or 3 essays in which I was expected to demonstrate both my factual knowledge of the material and my ability to think abstractly about it. This seemed to me a perfectly logical way to construct tests. Of course, I was the wise ass who, when one of my undergraduate professors asked me to list 4 operas by Mozart named Bastian und Bastian, La Finta Semplice, Der Schauspieldirektor, and La Clemenza di Tito. Factual knowledge, of course I had it. It got there by osmosis, I suppose. Now, in our days of externalized knowledge, it seemed my students were increasingly incapable of remembering anything not presented to them in the form of a short list of things to memorize. I wondered if others were finding this to be true as well. The exchange that followed led to the genesis of this morning's session, in which we will hear 4 experienced pedagogues present perspectives on my questions and offer some novel ideas and solutions. So our first speaker, I believe, is Molly Breckling.
Good morning. I think it's reasonable to assert that any musicologist's teaching philosophy will be influenced, for better or for worse, by their own experiences as students. With this in mind, if you'll pardon a few moments of nostalgia and overlook my youthful naivete and arguably ignorance, I'd like to briefly outline my own music history education to explore how it has impacted my approach to sifting through materials in my own classroom. My higher education journey was a long, sporadic process that unfolded over the course of 20 years. I began college at a small state school in Wisconsin in 1990, and during our freshman year, music majors took a 2-semester course called Music Literature. The purpose of the class was to instill listening skills and basic knowledge of composers and genres. During sophomore year, we took music history, which looked at the same music in greater detail and ensured that we had sufficient historical knowledge to treat composers with due reverence, both on stage and in the practice room. To say that these courses were extremely positivistic would be an understatement. I recall a test question in which we were to list from memory all of the cities in which Bach had worked as a composer and the years he was in each place. Truthfully, it wasn't until many years later that it even dawned on me the value of this information, which of course was that these cities each offered a different kind of environment and thus inspired different compositional output from Bach. We were not encouraged to think of composers as people with human lives, emotions, and obligations. We were simply told to know the facts with no context, and so I did. As such, I emerged from college with a bachelor's degree and an almost religious reverence towards the myth of composer as lone genius, locked away in an ivory tower creating masterpieces. There's something oddly charming and certainly antiquated about this idea of myself as a student, dutifully digesting facts and figures without ever questioning their purpose or even trying to draw connections among them. But alas, I think we would all agree that such an approach to music history pedagogy would not go over well in this day. I can still vividly remember the singular moment when I began to realize that a vital part of my understanding of music and its history was missing. I was sitting in a 20th century music theory class while working on the first of what would become 3 master's degrees. Our professor was talking about Schoenberg and the creation of the 12-tone system, and he told us that this method was a response to the composer's experiences in World War I. He explained that the system, as a method of controlling atonality, essentially made sense out of chaos. This provided Schoenberg with something he needed both musically, to prolong pure atonality over extended periods of time, and personally, to deal with the horrors of wartime violence. This comment, which I'm sure to my old theory professor was merely parenthetical, was like a bolt of lightning to my thinking about music. Not only did it help me understand the logic behind a highly complex compositional process, but it completely changed the way I think about composers and their work. This was my first introduction to the notion of musicology rather than music history, a discipline that not only looked at the music itself and the mythical figures that created it, but explored those composers as part of their larger world and surroundings. Music became so much more complex and endlessly more fascinating, and that's saying something as someone who had already devoted 6 years of higher education to the field. But nonetheless, my notion of music history was forever changed that day. Now, we fast forward to my 3rd master's degree about 10 years later. My classmates and I are working together to prepare for doctoral qualifying exams, and I find myself astonished by the basic factual things that they don't know. They have all been educated during the early days of the new musicology, and it would seem, from my perspective at least, that my friends' backgrounds were light years away from mine. My colleagues can read Adorno in their sleep and derive brilliant conclusions from it, but they can't tell the difference between a motet and a madrigal. They struggle to identify terms that I had memorized years ago. Here we find the opposite extreme of my undergraduate education, all context with no facts. Within this relatively short period of time, the teaching of music history seemed to swing from one end of the pendulum to the other. I just happened to be fortunate, or unfortunate if you prefer, to catch both ends of the spectrum. To further illustrate the tension between these extremes, I dusted off my old music literature book, the 1990 edition of Forney & Machlis's The Enjoyment of Music. I also have a sample copy of the updated 2013 edition, to which Andrew Dell'Antonio has been added, and I'd like to read a brief passage from each to demonstrate changing perspectives. The 1990 edition describes the rise of 19th century musical nationalism in a simple and straightforward way that may verge on oversimplification. In 19th century Europe, political conditions encouraged the growth of nationalism to such a degree that it became a decisive force within the Romantic movement. National tensions on the continent, the pride of the conquering nations, and struggle for freedom of the oppressed ones gave rise to emotions that found an ideal expression in music. Now, the same idea is described in the 2013 edition with considerably more nuance and 21st century cultural sensitivity. Since the 19th century, the notion of community has been strongly tied to the concept of nationality, a distinctive culture and heritage shared by people who live in a common territory. But although individuals are associated with a nation by birth or immigration, they can choose whether or not and how to highlight that association through their music. While both descriptions accurately provide the idea of nation as potential inspiration for musical expression, the earlier description seems to imply that all composers in the 19th century felt nationalist impulses and those were necessarily reflected in their work. The more recent text is considerably more nuanced, but more complex. On one hand, it offers the possibility that not all 19th century composers held opinions that might be perceived as nationalistic, which is surely true. But on the other, it poses national sentiment as a spectrum rather than a binary. The question is no longer, was composer A a nationalist, but how did composer A feel about the political status in his or her homeland, and was this idea reflected in his or her compositions, and how? So why is this a problem? Surely this kind of critical thought regarding composers and the worlds that influence their music is valuable, right? Well, of course it is. But the difficulty comes into play in the classroom. If I'm lucky, I have one 55-minute class period to discuss 19th century nationalism in music. I can either make generalizations about the political motivations of these composers, which belies their individual motives and distinctiveness, or I can focus on one, say Smetana, and ignore Dvorak, the Mighty Five, Elgar, Vaughan Williams, the Scandinavians, and all the others, thus preventing me from covering some wonderful music with my class. Time simply does not allow for sufficient depth on every composer I want to cover, and thus choices must be made. And that's where I finally come to the point of all my ramblings. However one wants to label the extremes at question here, positivism versus postmodernism, objectivity versus subjectivity, formalism versus contextualism, the questions at stake are simple. What do our students need to know to be successful in their future endeavors? And how can we convey that material in a way that our students will find valuable and engaging? Finding the right balance between the facts and the meanings is something we must actively do every time we create a lesson plan or set an assignment. Each of us in this room will utilize their own student body for their own classroom. But I suspect that for many of us, it has become so second nature to bring in our personal interests and value systems that we don't really think about it. But consider it we must, lest we stray too far on the wrong side of the path. For all intents and purposes, I think it's important for us to recognize that while musicology and music history are important to us, for the vast majority of music majors, our music history classes are not the student's central focus. Surely we can inform how our students perform, understand, and talk about music, but it is important that we continually ask the question, do my students need or even want this information? For me, the most significant deciding factor on how I balance fact with context and interpretation in the classroom is my students. The undergraduate program at the University of West Georgia has a bachelor's program in music education and performance. That said, I think I can safely and undisparagingly say that few performance majors at UWG realistically envision their future selves on stage at the Met. So what am I preparing my students to do? Teach, either in the classroom or in the studio. Keeping this in mind, paired with the fact that our music history sequence at UWG gives me 2 semesters with 165 minutes per week to teach Western music history from antiquity to last week, and included a unit on world music, I have found that a postmodern, subjective, and heavily contextualized approach to the material I teach is ultimately neither very useful nor feasible. While I allow my students opportunities to explore these kinds of ideas in the classroom and occasionally bring up the philosophies behind them, critical theory rarely plays much of a role with my students. For me, it's sufficient that they think about the music. I don't need them to think about thinking about the music, only to know that they can. But approaching these young people as future educators, I'm very open about my pedagogical decisions in my music history classroom. We discuss composers from the viewpoint of their life and works, but we also talk about music from the viewpoint of someone who will someday teach it to someone else. We talk about pedagogical and musicological debates like canon formation and the dangers of essentializing cultures in world music studies. I give them choices and then work with them to create a class that achieves my goals while also satisfying their needs. Some recent assignments that I presented to my class have sought to give my students the opportunity to think about music in both a positivistic and a more contextualized way. As my class is specified as a writing-intensive course, students have a specific amount of writing that they must produce. I've tried in past years to complete this task in the form of a lengthy research paper on a topic of their choosing, but recently I've looked at smaller, more varied projects. I enjoy giving my students the chance to debate musicological issues of the past, and this semester we did it in writing. During our discussion of late 19th century music, we read about and discussed the debates regarding the merits of program versus absolute music. After reading about the ideas in the textbook, the class was divided into team program and team absolute. Students were given essays from the 19th century to read on both sides of the debate, and each student then wrote an essay of their own from the perspective of 19th century aesthetics, defending their assigned stance. Once the initial essays were all posted on a discussion board, each student then selected another student from the opposing team and responded to them directly. And then finally, each student replied to their own respondent. The written debate spread out over the course of 2 weeks, during which they engaged with the ideas behind the 2 types of music, as well as the aesthetic and philosophical ideas behind them. In follow-up discussion, the students reported that their ideas about and appreciation of these kinds of music grew stronger due to the exercise. A later writing assignment was inspired by an album that I heard on Tidal. The album, entitled Toward for Claire to Nacht, examines that work as a product of several earlier works that might be viewed as forefathers to its specific compositional ideas. We spent several days dissecting the Toward Verklar's Nacht album, listening to and discussing the connections between each influencing work and the final product, and then the students were tasked with creating a playlist in the same vein. They not only had to choose a piece from the late 19th or 20th century and identify 3 earlier works with similar musical features, but they were instructed to research the creation of their chosen piece, seeking specific references to any possible influences and elaborating on them in writing. This project encouraged students to think about music in an almost evolutionary way. Once the assignment was complete, we discussed whether or not this notion was valid. The responses were mixed, and the students began to recognize that while the thought of music's evolutionary progression was valid for some works, it did not work in all instances. This discussion about composers' relationships with music of the past provided the students with a hands-on way to explore the compositional process and its myriad influences. So as you can see, my approach to balancing music history as a series of names, dates, and places with musicology as an opportunity to explore those ideas in a broader context in the classroom is still evolving. I do, however, firmly believe that today's undergraduate music student, regardless of their chosen discipline within the field, must have a solid grounding in the facts before they can move on to the context. Failing to provide either side of the equation provides a disservice to our students, but the factual foundation must be firmly in place. So I will continue to seek out new ways to present this material in a way that serves the needs of my student population, and I look forward to discussing these ideas with you at the end of the panel.
Thank you, Molly. Our next speaker is Louis Epstein, who will talk to us about a game he has developed, the music history game.
First of all, I want to make sure everyone can see. If you're sitting in the way back there, I don't know, about 15, 20 seats up front, so you might want to move up. There's some text here, and we will be playing the game. So, my students and I have been playing games in class for a long time. In the music history survey in particular, we play Name That Tune almost every day. Sometimes we play the philology game and try to put unidentified, unknown score examples in chronological order. My students try to game my listening ID tests by memorizing quirks of particular recordings and by identifying pieces based on instrumentation rather than style characteristics. I parry by changing up recordings, playing unknown excerpts, and asking questions that require students to apply memorized piece titles, dates, genres, and composer names in the service of critical thinking. For the students, the game is over when they finish the course. But for their professor, the game continues in the form of a mystery. Did my students really satisfy the learning outcomes I set at the beginning of the semester? And I present, these are just 3 of 5. These are the ones that most apply to the game. Did they distinguish orally between pieces from different times and places by identifying and explaining relevant style characteristics? Did they apply sophisticated listening skills to the task of describing known and unknown music using appropriate terminology? And did they situate a given piece in its historical context, as Molly was just discussing, by describing how it relates to music that came before and after, as well as to the wider world in which it was written? I imagine many of these look familiar to you. In an attempt to determine whether students were really satisfying these learning outcomes, and in acknowledgement of the many ways in which learning music history is already game-like, I've developed an online flashcard-based game that I have cleverly titled The Music History Game. And I'm going to give you a chance to see what the game looks and sounds like, and I'll actually give you a chance to play it, so bear with me for a second. Oh, we need sound. Is there an audio jack? So, who composed this piece? Good job. All right, here's a harder one. Guesses? 3. All right. Good work. Let's do 2 more. All right, so you get the idea. We could keep going. It's a lot of fun. I should tell you just a couple of things that we don't necessarily see from playing. So you notice that the color of the card has been yellow this whole time. That signifies that these are medium difficulty questions. If you were to get a number of them right in a row, the game is adaptive, so it pushes you up to a harder level of question. The card turns red, the questions get more difficult. If you get a couple wrong, you go down to an easier question, the cards turn green. And those are based on difficulty levels that I originally set. And I'll talk more about that later. The game is organized as a series of levels, topics within levels, so you have to pass a certain number of topics to get through a level and move on to the next one. There's often a review boss at the end of a level with many more questions. And then if you, I'll show you this. So if you finish, right. If you finish a topic, you get to see this review sort of box that shows you exactly which questions you got right, which questions you got wrong, so you can go back and just do the ones that you got wrong. And if, depending on how difficult I want it to be, if you get 100% or sometimes just if you pass the topic, there's often a reward at the end. You're welcome. You get the idea. We won't watch that whole lot. Okay. I'll admit that the idea for this game emerged out of intuition rather than out of scholarship. As a musician, I recognize the importance of constant practice for learning skills and content. Happily, my intuition that practicing music history through gameplay, much as students practice their instruments, the idea that this would be good for students is supported by plenty of research showing that certain kinds of practice can be particularly effective. And my design for the game applied insights from that research. For example, Henry Rediger III, a psychologist at Wash U in St. Louis, has shown that frequent and varied retrieval of factual information more effectively engenders lasting retention of content than repeated studying without retrieval. So more retrieval is better than just studying. In other words, while I tend to employ testing as an infrequent form of high-stakes, summative assessment, my students are better served by more frequent, low-stakes, formative assessment. Simply, despite its bad rap, testing can be helpful, and I should actually do it more often. The game makes it possible for me to test my students constantly without having to grade constantly, and without the psychological burden that testing so often imposes on students prone to performance anxiety. Moreover, combining Rediger's work with research on the pedagogical benefits of gamification, I realized that I could use testing to teach, especially content that I didn't have time to address in class. For instance, I'd always longed for a way to prove to my students that the long, short rhythm of Sermy's Tant que vivre and the double dotting of Lully's Overture to Armide weren't isolated examples, but rather were representative of far more widespread compositional practices. I recognized the potential for a game to present known and unknown listenings alongside each other, to introduce unfamiliar material while simultaneously assessing students' recognition and understanding of material that I'd taught in class. Other research has informed the game's structure and the design of individual questions. For example, it turns out that varying the timing and nature of retrieval is important. Cramming for a test, also known as massed practice, does not produce the same learning gains as slower and steadier studying, also known as spaced practice, and this is probably obvious to most of us. Less obvious is that you retain more of what you learn when you move frequently between different kinds of problems, rather than seeking to gain proficiency in one type of problem solving before moving on, a technique called interleaving. Encouragingly, researchers have found that spaced, interleaved retrieval practice doesn't just help you retain information longer. It can also help you develop conceptual knowledge by improving discriminability or the categorization of groups as distinct from each other, exactly what we want students learning style characteristics to be able to do. Robert Bjork of UCLA has built on Rediger's work by showing that the more cognitive effort you exert in retrieval practice, the greater the gains. So that's more pain, more gain. This effect is only limited by the phenomenon called desirable difficulty, suggesting that students learn best when they answer questions that are difficult enough to challenge them, but not so difficult as to discourage them. Desirable difficulty is also the principle by which many video games are designed. It's the principle that makes games addictive, even as they teach you specialized skills like solving elaborate mazes or hijacking a moving train. Skills you will hopefully never use in real life. And that's one reason why gamifying music history makes so much sense. Students who might normally be resistant to learning somewhat esoteric facts about music that they feel they'll never need to use, so Bach's cities, can be persuaded to treat memorization as a fun challenge, motivated by the feeling of mastery that comes with successful gameplay, rather than by the threat of poor grades or being called on in class. And then I'll just add two more benefits that research supports. So the testing effect, what I've been talking about all along, also suggests that getting questions wrong can help students learn, since they're more likely to correctly answer the question they got wrong the first time and others like it in the future. That's why giving a test at the end of the semester means students are less likely to learn because they're less likely to hit those questions again. And then it's also beneficial to test students on material they haven't yet learned as a way of priming them for more lasting learning when they do encounter that material in class or elsewhere. I'm aware that similar quizzing platforms to mine exist through learning management systems like Moodle and Blackboard, and that web-based apps like Quizlet, Top Hat, and Socrative make it possible to gamify assessment. But based on the research I've presented, I didn't think that any of these was flexible enough or dedicated enough for my purposes. That is, students already go to Moodle for other schoolwork. I call Moodle the place where fun goes to die. They make their own quizzes and games on Quizlet. I wanted something that didn't have any prior psychological associations for my students and a dedicated place where they could go to maybe, just maybe, have fun with music history. For other reasons too, including cost, interface aesthetics, the ease of creating questions, and the pedagogical value of having students in our computer science department custom design an app specific to my class, I chose not to use these services, but I am eager to hear from all of you about positive experiences you've had with any of these tools. So how did the music history game work out in practice? It turns out one advantage of gamifying music history studying is that I'm in a better position than ever to actually measure aspects of my students' learning and of my teaching. First, it's important to point out that because I didn't have to grade students' practice, because the game evaluated their responses, I could ask them many, many more questions than I normally ask on in-class quizzes and tests. In the fall semester alone, they collectively answered more than 50,000 questions. And that includes repeats, but 60 students answering approximately 900 to 1,000 questions each. And I can actually show you, this is just a screencast of what the stats page on the game looks like. Only I can see this, students can't see it. But you can maybe make out those numbers in the third column, that's total questions answered. They're in the thousands for a while. And the stats page also shows me the percentage correct, as well as questions they got correct out of the total questions answered. Okay. Just seeing the sheer number of questions each student has answered by the time of various checkpoints over the course of the semester gives me a better sense for their ability to keep up with assignments and prepare for class. To a certain extent, the game opens the black box of student study habits, and I can tell you more in the Q&A about the game's ability to keep track of things like time on task, grit in the face of failure, and common misconceptions. The game also makes it possible to design and execute double-blind, randomized, controlled experiments. While I still have a lot to learn in this area, my first effort this year involved dividing the class in half and giving a control group innocuous follow-up questions to unknown listening IDs. So asking them, after asking them who might have composed the piece, asking them when or where they think the piece might have been composed. Those were the innocuous questions, while giving a test group follow-up questions that engaged metacognitive processes. Metacognition involves exerting active control over your cognitive processes. In other words, knowing what you know and how you know it. Metacognitive follow-up questions in the game asked how students identified a piece or allowed them to select from a list of style characteristics that might have been most important in making their decisions. And I'll show you what this looked like. So they're listening to two excerpts, trying to figure out which one was composed earliest. Doesn't really matter which one they select. It doesn't have to be right. But then they get this follow-up question that says, how did you figure that out, right? And it gives them a number of choices, and they can select more than one. And so in this case, it was, I don't know, maybe it was Scarlatti. Here's one where they have to identify the composer, and then it's open-ended. So how did you determine who the composer of this piece was? And then they type in how they identify the composer of the piece. And I suspect that many of us ask questions like these on our exams already, but this was a way for me to try to quantify how students were engaging with their metacognitive processes. I hope to learn whether increased practice answering metacognitive follow-ups would help students more accurately identify and describe unknown excerpts, in effect, transferring the content knowledge they learned in class to new repertories. This particular study produced negative results. There was no correlation between answering more metacognitive questions and correctly identifying unknowns, and I could talk about why I think that was. There was, however, one important positive result. I showed that games like this one can be used to produce meaningful experimental data that can help explain how students learn music history and how they can learn it better. As for evaluating my own teaching, you'll remember that I assigned each question a preliminary difficulty level that helped determine which questions students see after they answered a series of questions right or wrong. I worked with a team of statistics and computer science majors to measure the extent to which the difficulties I assigned matched the difficulties generated by the game in response to students' right or wrong answers. So, for example, if 90% of students got a question wrong the first time they encountered it, the game changed my difficulty level and reassigned a difficulty level of 9 out of 10. If 10% of students got a question wrong, the game gave it a difficulty level of 1. Comparing my original assigned difficulties with the game's normalized distribution of difficulties around 5 produces this graph. And while it's a little bit difficult to read because the scales are so tiny, it shows the average distance between the difficulty level I assigned and the one the game reassigned each question after the students had answered it. And the normal distribution here is what we'd expect. In most cases, the difficulty I assigned matched the difficulty students experienced in answering the questions within a range. This kind of analysis helps me determine whether I'm aware of how difficult students find my questions, and maybe gets at Robin's issue that he mentioned at the beginning. And it reveals the extent of my implicit bias as an expert against my students' novice experience of the questions that I asked. And of course, if I had gotten a different result, I might have redesigned my questions accordingly. The music history game is still under development. There are many technological kinks to work out, and I'm currently revising my experimental design in anticipation of running another controlled study next year. But the game's capacity to offer students extra practice while creating opportunities to engage in the science of teaching and learning means that it's a worthwhile investment of my time. And students seem to find the game valuable too. I heart the music history game, says one. In evaluations of the course, they've acknowledged the benefit of added practice, a psychological benefit as much as a pedagogical one, and some, to my relief, actually find it to be fun to play. So this student noticed that some of the questions, the circle all that apply, were tricky. Great, because those also appear on the tests. And then another student mentioned playing it for hours, which they might not have been mentioning as a positive, but I see it as a positive. So given my students' approval, it's fair to say that my students and I will continue playing music history games for a long time to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis. Our next speaker is Matt Baumer, who will speak to us about some empirical data he obtained during some extensive observation of perhaps some of us teaching.
Good morning. For many of us, the most central and familiar course we teach is the Survey of Western Art Music. Its prominence in music major curricula has remained largely unchallenged over the years, although this is beginning to change, as evidenced by Harvard's new decentered undergrad curriculum. The objective of the survey might once have seemed obvious. The student will be able to outline the main periods, composers, and works of Western art music from antiquity through the 20th century. However, generations of students have found it difficult to memorize and retain this large body of facts, as witnessed by such courses as the Graduate Music History Review, a remedial course in which students relearn material they covered only a year or two earlier. Given these developments, I wanted to study how music history teachers are reacting to these concerns in practice. During a sabbatical last spring, I took the opportunity to travel to 13 universities and observe a wide variety of music history, music appreciation, and ethnomusicology classes. 25 of those classes were part of a music history survey sequence, including 4 instances of the Graduate History Review course. They were taught by 17 different instructors at 11 institutions. Obviously, these classes were heavy with facts, yet the instructors differed significantly in their objectives and their pedagogy. For a few, learning the facts was clearly the primary objective, and the pedagogy was structured to emphasize memorization and recall. A more common approach was to treat the facts as the foundation for larger interpretive goals, such as understanding post-war modernism or how a symphony creates meaning. On the other end of the spectrum, one instructor treated the facts as incidental to the real objective of building musicological skills, such as leading a discussion, reading scholarly articles, and research writing. Today I will describe approaches and highlight the advantages and disadvantages. As I promised the participants, I will omit any identifying details of the institutions or the instructors to preserve their anonymity. There is little doubt that Music History Survey disseminates many facts. To get an idea of how many, I transcribed and coded video recordings from 5 survey classes representing the different approaches I observed. Using qualitative research software, I marked up the videos with 19 codes representing different kinds of facts, a few teaching techniques, and 2 special categories, as you can see in this. I know it's rather small. If you want to download this and see the whole thing at once, on the second slide that I'll show, there's a link to the whole thing. But this is basically just the list of the facts that I coded and so forth. 2 special categories, dates and names, capture items that students find difficult to recall on exams, in my experience. Dates and names were also coded under other categories, so I've separated them to avoid double counting. Similarly, I did not include the teaching techniques codes in the fact count. I'll address those later. The interpretation of what constitutes a single fact is slippery. For example, in the sentence, Georg Friedrich Händel was born in Halle in Saxony in 1685, there is a name, a date, and a place, yet all are related to Händel, which binds them together as a single fact. So generally, I coded the information in a single clause or sentence as a single fact. Across the 5 classes I studied, the average number of facts presented was 93, with a low of 55 and a high of 163. This equals a rate of 1.5 facts per minute of class, or 15 facts for every 10 minutes. I must admit that I have no context for this number, because I'm unaware of any research that suggests how many facts a person can absorb in a class. This would obviously depend on the person and the material, but it makes sense that learners have a certain capacity to absorb facts, and that a lecture could exceed this capacity. Maybe you have experienced that. Also, research suggests that much of the work of building recall comes after the initial presentation, and more facts means more work to transfer them into long-term memory. At face value, 15 facts every 10 minutes does seem daunting. At this rate, a semester's worth of music history could easily present more than 3,000 facts, not counting facts presented in the textbook but not discussed in class. And I think Lewis's game of showing students answering more than 1,000 questions would maybe testify to that. Of course, these facts are of varying importance, and instructors probably do not expect students to remember all of them. I did not have access to course exams, but it would be intriguing to know how many of these facts were actually tested on the exam. Also leads to the question, if we do not expect students to remember a third or even half of the facts we present, why present them in the first place? There may be valid reasons for doing so, but that's for another paper. As I mentioned, each of the 5 classes I selected for coding took a different approach to teaching the facts. 2 of the 5 stand out as having presented the greatest and the least number of facts by far, I'll call their instructors the quizmaster and the facilitator, respectively. The remaining 3 classes fall into what I would consider the mainstream lecture format with some important differences between them. I'll call those instructors the lecturer, the lecture activator, and the tour guide. And you can see the complete tally for each of their codes in this slide here, and then there's also the link if you want to get the entire thing to see in one PDF. Let's see. Sorry, I lost my place here. Oh, there we go. The quizmaster presented 163 facts over a period of 56 minutes at a rate of 2.9 per minute, almost double the average. The nickname is not meant derogatively, but rather as a description of how the class proceeded. The instructor spent the first 10 minutes of class reviewing material from the previous class in the format of an oral quiz. There were plenty of volunteers, perhaps because students could refer to their notes, and there were no points given or subtracted for their answers. Each exchange lasted less than a minute. After this review, the instructor embarked on new material, in this case on Handel, but this new material actually began with another 10-minute review, this time of opera seria. Once again, the instructor posed rapid-fire questions that volunteers answered. After a few words of praise, correction, or explanation, the next exchange began. Over the course of the class, the instructor asked 46 questions over 56 minutes, considerably more than the next highest tally, which was 37 questions in 72 minutes. With this review component, the quizmaster demonstrated the strongest commitment to teaching the facts of the people that I observed. The overall number of facts was certainly high, but perhaps 40% or more were not new to the students. This review, which was clearly a regular feature of the course and which I did not observe in any other class, has a sound pedagogical justification. According to the recent book, Make It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning, by psychologists Henry Roedinger and Mark McDaniel and novelist Peter Brown, and this is some of the research that Lewis was citing, the most important factor in achieving long-term knowledge is the learner's continual, effortful review and application of that knowledge. Quizzes, while old-fashioned, provide a challenge to the memory that helps long-term recall, especially when they continually return to the same material. While this technique may sound stressful and tedious, it did not come across this way. The quizmaster had a pleasant, relaxed manner that belied the speed and efficiency of the questions. Students seemed to be comfortable with the routine of the review. However, I was not able to keep track of what percentage of students answered questions, and from experience, I know that less confident students tend to avoid them. Calling on students randomly might have raised the participation rate, but it would also have raised the stakes for embarrassment. The low-stakes format and the sheer volume of review questions encouraged all students to participate, even if they did not answer questions out loud. In the 3 classes employing the mainstream lecture technique, the number of facts presented was considerably lower. The lecturer, the lecture activator, and the tour guide presented 72, 82, and 95 facts, respectively, for an average of 1.3 facts per minute. While each instructor occasionally referred to material from previous classes, none had an organized review component. All 3 posed questions to the class as part of their presentations, although the lecturer posed only 10 questions as compared to 33 and 37 for the other 2 instructors. For the lecturer, the objective of the day was to unfold the mysteries of John Cage's music. With fewer facts presented, the pace of this class was more comfortable than that of the quizmaster, allowed for more time spent listening, and encouraged students to give longer, more reflective answers to the instructor questions. To some extent, this reflects the nature of Cage's work, but I never felt that the number of facts was restricted or insufficient. The lecture was well organized and smoothly delivered, and students seemed to be engaged throughout. If there was a downside, it would be that for students to develop long-term recall, they would need to spend more time out of class reviewing and engaging with the material. While the lecturer posed relatively few questions, the questions invited more speculation and synthesis than did the quizmasters. The major difference between the lecturer and the lecture activator was that the latter devoted a substantial part of class to an activity in which students analyzed 2 da capo arias using a worksheet. The class began with a well-crafted lecture on Neapolitan opera. Like the quizmaster, the lecture activator posed numerous questions, 33 in all, that required short, factual answers. Many of these questions asked students to recall previous material, while others aimed to make it relevant. For example, the instructor asked jazz studies majors what they typically practice, then equated their experience with the training of Neapolitan opera singers. In the second part of the class, the instructor divided the students into groups and asked them to analyze the form and text setting of a da capo aria. Here there is an interesting comparison with the quizmaster, who also taught a da capo aria. The quizmaster narrated the progress of the form while playing the recording, telling students when the intermediary ritornello or the B section appeared. They could follow this in their anthology score and on a handout. In contrast, the lecture activator asked each group of 3 students to find these locations themselves. When the groups came back together, the instructor then narrated through each aria to solidify the correct answers. Students also reflected on the text-music relationship and proposed how musical devices reflected the text. At least in theory, the opportunity for students to apply their knowledge of the da capo aria should aid in long-term recall and build their analysis skills. The downside is that this technique required almost 30 minutes more class time, which the quizmaster devoted to review and other material. The tour guides split the difference between the lecturer's approach and that of the lecture activator. An introductory talk about Mahler led into a lengthy tour through the first movement of a symphony. The instructor would play a passage and then ask students such questions as, "Have we heard this before?" or "What is the affect of this section?" Gradually, the instructor built towards an interpretation of the movement's meaning. The instructor's approach called on students to be more active than with the lecturer, but less active than with the lecture activator. Given that the tour guide only solicited volunteers to answer, it was certainly possible for students to sit passively instead of working through the movement. The final instructor was the facilitator, who took a very different approach. In fact, the facilitator would not describe this course as a music history survey at all, even though it occupied a similar space in the curriculum as a core course for majors. Instead of a chronological survey, the course investigated the major themes of historical musicology. As I mentioned earlier, the facts of the course were less important than the skills it aimed to develop. On the day I visited, the instructor did not present anything. 2 students led a discussion of some course readings, while the instructor silently took notes. In previous meetings, the instructor had coached the students on how to lead a discussion and was now evaluating them on this skill. In the discussion, students mentioned 55 facts by my tally, certainly far fewer than were presented in the lecture classes. These facts were perhaps more meaningful to the students because they had to recall and articulate them rather than hearing them from the instructor. Also, most facts were drawn from articles students read prior to class, and using them in a discussion could aid in recall and understanding. The downside is that there is far less certainty about which facts will be covered, discussed, or remembered. When the goal is to develop musicological skills, that is perhaps not a problem, but it might be if the objective was to master a particular body of information. By ceding control of the discussion, the instructor also loses the opportunity to interject leading questions and direct attention to significant or challenging aspects of the topic. I also wondered whether students in the discussion were any more involved than students in a lecture or other activity. Not everyone spoke or spoke frequently, and it is possible that some were not engaged. However, there is little doubt that the students leading the discussion were far more active than the typical student in attending a lecture. These approaches to teaching the facts reflect the diversity of music history pedagogy today. For most instructors, the goal remains to cover the entirety of the canon at some level, and for students to recall as much of that information as possible. Others believe that this difficult task, made harder by the continuing expansion of musical knowledge, must give way to an approach where students can acquire facts on a need-to-know basis for when they lead a discussion or complete a writing project. Whatever decision we make about our objectives, it is crucial that we choose our techniques accordingly. For those of us teaching the more or less traditional survey, we should consider how to better integrate review and practice into our courses. Given the perpetual rush to simply cover the material, we might consider reducing the number of facts we cover and spend more time allowing students to reflect on them. For those of us who wish to move beyond the survey, it is still worth contemplating how best to teach the facts that are important to our objectives. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Our final speaker is Rebecca Marchand.
Sorry, we're just switching computers for a second. There we go. Good morning. I think to some extent I'm going to be talking about thinking about music that Molly addressed, but it's a means to an end, so I'll say that. Many students to focus on what do I need to know for the test. I think we've all come across that. A lot of students struggle with this idea of teaching to the test, and most commonly this is connected to the memorization of facts of varying types, whether it's biography, dates, genre, or terminology. I have found that giving students agency to define or redefine the narrative itself can help students to take a more active interest in these facts rather than viewing them as exercises in rote memorization. This presentation will highlight 4 strategies and concrete activities that can help reframe these facts as entry points for critical thinking rather than something that they just have as tidbits of knowledge that they may or may not use as cocktail conversation at some point. So I'm going to go over 4 different activities. Composer dossiers, as I call them. This is a first day activity as well as a follow-up last day activity. Focused free writing, the use of prompts to activate this kind of thinking about narrative. Textbook outline assignment, which definitely needs a sexier title. I'm open to suggestions. And finally, a mix and match exam review to prepare them for a final exam. And by the way, I do have a fuller transcript of this available, very minimalist PowerPoint, so if you would like that, you are free to email me and I will send it to you. The goal with these composer dossiers is bipartite. The first is diagnostic. It gives you an opportunity on the very first day to see where they're at least in terms of what they know about composers. And then the second part is it really does illuminate the concept of privilege in narrative. And there are some people in your book and some people not in your book kind of idea. So in the activity, the students are split up into groups. Each group is handed a piece of paper with the name of a composer on the top. Collectively, the group then has to list relevant information about that composer or their output until they've exhausted what they know. There are 2 rules that I developed after experience with this. The first one is you may not list pieces unless you'd like to see a duplication of the Grove lists of works for Beethoven, for example. You may not list pieces. And the second one is you must have a reasonable basis of knowledge and it needs to be relevant. So Monteverdi Has Green Eyes is not something that needs to be on that list, okay? So they will come up with some really random things if you don't curtail that. To give you an example, I have typed up, I don't know if you can see it. 2 examples. Now, as the instructor, you do want to manipulate this a little bit and give a wide range of composers. This was for a Baroque music history class. You'd want early composers versus late composers, female, male. It gets really interesting. So we have on Barbara Strozzi, the group that had Barbara Strozzi, she was Italian, I think. Good guess. Surprisingly, she was a courtesan. I was not expecting that, and I'm going to leave that there for a moment. Then we knew a lot more about J.S. Bach. He was a German composer of the later Baroque. He had lots of children, including J.C. CPE. These are direct quotes, by the way. Contributed to many genres. Married Anna Magdalena at some point. Lived and worked in Leipzig. Lived and worked in Curtin, question mark, which I sort of love. Influenced by Buxtehude and used well-tempered tuning systems. So the point of this exercise is not actually for them to be correct or thorough. Some of these are very generalized, which is totally fine. What I then do is I post the papers up on the whiteboard with tape, and so they can see the disparity between the information known about Bach versus Barbara Strozzi, just visually. I don't worry about what's true on them on the first day. I save them, and sometimes I post them online, and we revisit them, ideally, at the end of the class. And we revisit the activity, we do it over again, and then I post the old and the new dossiers side by side. So they can see what they now think is important, what they've learned, what they got wrong. By the end of the semester, everybody knew Köthen was spelled C-O-umlaut-T-H-E-N. And, you know, so it's a really good way for them to invest in biography, for example, invest in learning about these composers. The second activity is something I use a lot, free writing. I'm sure many people in this room use free writing, in particular focused free writing. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with it, this is the process of having students write continuously for 6 to 7 minutes is usually what I do, to a prompt. And the idea is that they're not censoring themselves, they're just kind of vomiting the ideas out onto the page, not worrying about punctuation, not worrying about editing, not crossing anything out. So it's a really useful activity for thinking about narrative if you construct prompts that get them moving in that direction. So I have a couple of examples. You might consider a speculative prompt that challenges the narrative. Imagine Guillaume de Machaut as a woman. Imagine the impact on her and Uve in the 14th century. This particular prompt can go a number of different ways, and that's exactly what you want with free writing. These are not essay prompts. These are not essay exam prompts. These are prompts to get them thinking. The second one is what Nicole Wallach calls making connections. You could attach it to having them read something. After reading Beethoven's Heiligenstadt Testament, what connections can you make to this music? Now that's a really vague question, but again, we want them to think about what the connections actually are that they can make, not just prescribe them. And then the last one I'm calling a hybrid, because normally in free writing you don't give them a type of document to work with, but in this one you might prepare them for an assignment where they need to read Haydn's contract with the Esterházys, but before they read it, say you are Principal Anton Esterházy and you've just hired Joseph Haydn as Vice Kapellmeister. Write up a contract for him. And this is really illuminating because then they see the difference between their idea of what they would hire a composer for and what happens in the 18th century. So that's how to use free writing to challenge the narrative. Now we have the textbook outline assignment. The goals of this are to get them thinking about a big picture narrative and an appreciation for what is left out. What is the nature even of a textbook? And there are two different activities here. The first one I use with graduate students in our Communicating About Music class. They have an assignment where they have to construct a music appreciation syllabus, and they look at 4 different music appreciation textbooks to assess which one they want to use. Well, before they do that, I prepare them in class, I get them together in pairs, and I say, okay, you need to give me a table of contents, essentially, for a music appreciation textbook. You can only have 7 chapters. And we talk about the role of audience. We talk about popular versus traditional versus vernacular versus cultivated. We talk about chronological approaches versus other approaches. And then I sort of let them at it. They have to agree with each other, which is always interesting as well. So that's kind of a quick preparatory assignment. The second one I've done with a Baroque music history class where they are using a larger textbook, Burkholder, Bonds, etc., where Baroque is just a little tiny part of their textbook. So I asked them to enlarge the narrative, envision a textbook that just covers Baroque music history. And so they come up with ideas of specific narratives versus generalized narratives. And they have to decide what's important. Do women composers get their own chapter, or are they spread throughout? These sorts of questions arise organically through the process of the assignment. And the last one, this is not a posed picture, even though it looks like it is. The last one is what I call the mix and match exam review. And the goal here is to help them prepare for exams, particularly essay exams or short answer exams, where they're connect terms to examples and other concepts. This is a really useful tool in helping students see multiple narratives, including that within their own class. They have multiple narratives of what they think is important and how things connect. So there are a couple different versions of this. Here is, I had a class of only 9 students, which was a luxury. And that's why I've done it on the whiteboard. Normally I use the walls of the room. But they're given an index card or a slip of paper if I run out of index cards. And on that slip of paper, there is a piece, a genre, a composer, a form, or something else. It could be a librettist, it could be a treatise, you know, something that doesn't fit into those categories. And I write those categories on the board, and then they are asked to, they're given a card, and they have to tape the card where it belongs in those categories. That's the first step. Then they step back and they look at what they've done. And the next step is what I call clustering. You can't see it. When I took that picture, I didn't think I'd be using it for a presentation. But you get the idea of what it kind of looks like. And on the left there, I have an example of one cluster they created, Stabat Mater, La Serva Padrona, Intermezzo, Pergolesi. So they took the terms and put them together. It's very useful for the instructor as well, because you find, you know, Zeus Meyer attached to San Martini for some reason, and you go, okay, that's something I need to address in this review. So it's also very diagnostic in that way. There will be terms that have no home. They just kind of are outliers on the little galaxy. And that's also instructive for them. But the students are told that they are allowed to move things. So I watched one student move string quartet from Mozart to the Haydn cluster. And we talked about why they did that. And that was really, really valuable. So I think facts are unavoidable, but I have found that if you ask students to think about what the facts are and what the narrative is, then they feel they have some sort of agency and we're not just opening up their head and pouring it in. So I hope that these were concrete examples, and I would encourage you to come up with activities that nurture this sort of thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you to all of our speakers for a stimulating panel. After hearing today's speakers, I realize I am something of an anomaly. I have always been a lecturer who enjoys stimulating students' imaginations and presenting them with novel ways to look at things. My goal has always been to leave them excited about the material, regardless of how many facts they remember. If Matt were to sit in on one of my classes, I suspect he would tabulate a quite low rate of facts per minute. I certainly hope so. In that sense, I suppose my sympathies are with Matt's facilitator, except that I like to talk. It's no coincidence that I wrote a music appreciation textbook with minimal historical information, and even that was urged on me by my publisher. I tell my students often that if time limitations leave them a choice between doing the reading or listening to the music, they should listen to the music. That way they'll be much better prepared for class. I have always imagined a sort of inverse relationship between the number of facts students learn and the amount of true musical understanding they acquire. More facts, less understanding; more understanding, fewer facts. Of course, the problem with such a reductionist approach is that it leads to the kind of extremes Molly describes. You either get all facts and no Adorno, or all Adorno and no facts. Both sides of the equation need to be addressed, and today's students are struggling more than ever with the factual side. Given the easy availability of externalized information, I suppose I am less concerned about that than I might be. I am also quite comfortable with Rebecca's idea of letting students construct their own factual narratives, since unless they have the kind of ownership she advocates, I'm still skeptical about how useful factual information will turn out to be for them. I'm also quite intrigued by Lewis's idea of what might be termed stealth testing, making it fun to practice factual knowledge and thus taking pressure off students and instructors alike. One of my graduate students recently did a series of interviews with musicians she knew about their experiences learning and performing music. While she was primarily interested in how they understood what they were doing in terms of communication with the audience, she consistently found that one of the biggest issues they wanted to talk about was performance anxiety. What is true in performance is true in testing as well. Anxiety has a way of causing memory lapses during performance and also causing facts to disappear during programs. I should add that, like I suspect many of you, I have been both amused and horrified to see postmodern relativism become a tool of the far political right, producing a world in which the phrase alternative facts is apparently not a contradiction. Many academics have recently had to re-examine their relationship with objective truth. Perhaps this panel would not even be happening if not for Fox News. So I would like to urge both caution and optimism. It is possible to overcompensate. Too much emphasis on facts and correct can still produce bored and frustrated students who don't understand why they have to know all this stuff and who enter our exams terrified of forgetting it. But those of us in this room have the tools and the ideas to find the middle ground that I suspect at some level we all seek, and our nation seeks as well. And with that, I would like to open the floor for questions and discussion. If you would, please identify yourself and speak clearly.
Hi, Chris Macklin. I guess one question I wanted to make sure I sort of established and kind of relates to all of them. What are we contrasting facts with? Like, what is a fact? Because as I was going through and listening to your talks, I kind of came up with different versions. So for like Rebecca, I felt like the contrast might have been between facts and narratives. Between Molly, maybe it was fact and theorizing. For other people, maybe it was a contrast between facts and lies. I'm not really sure. I guess. So I wanted to know if we had a shared common frame for what a fact is.
I struggled with that same question. I sat at the computer and said, okay, I need to read this paper. What am I talking about? and I finally looked to my own experience and kind of weighed it from that perspective. But I think I'm safe in saying that there was not a specific alternative that was presented for the panel.
I would just say that I think when we talk about facts in this way, I think we're probably, it may be useful to think about Bloom's taxonomy. I think we're probably talking about things on the lower end of Bloom's taxonomy rather than things that go higher up on that taxonomy. When I was counting facts in my research, I didn't make a distinction of that sort. Basically, if you were talking about, a theory, it could have also been a fact as far as I'm concerned. Just a discrete thing to know that the instructor presented and wanted students to remember.
Hi, I'm Ann Schruffler. I really like that question, and I also noticed this, and I think it's very healthy and very good that people had so different usages of the word fact, because a fact is not really a thing. You know, it's context-based, as all of you pointed out, and it is distinct from just raw data because it is evaluative in some sense. And I just want to recall, I'm sure many of you know this, that this wonderful chapter in Dahlhaus's introduction to what's it called? The Foundations, yes, Foundations of Music History. There's a whole chapter called What is a Musical Fact? Was ist eine musikalische Tatsache? And he starts the chapter with Schubert wrote Gretchen am Spinnrade in 1812 and then he says, is this a fact? And he says, if you start the chapter like that, then it's highly evaluative, it's highly subjective to start a chapter like that. So the position of it determines whether it's valued, or whether if it comes line 57 in a narrative, it's much more subservient. So, and then he goes into the distinction between the Tatsache, which is evaluative and contextual, and chosen, it's chosen by the researcher, and then the data. And you know, again, this book was written in 1977, and I think we might come out a little differently on this distinction between fact and data nowadays. But still, the data would be something more discrete, smaller, more perhaps less evaluative, less significant. And that, you know, you put it all together and you get this fact, which is a very complex idea. So I just wanted to recall that. But I think that's very good that these things are different in the different usages.
Andrew Shryock. My question was for Molly. You talked about organizing content around this sort of shared objective of your students, their future endeavors as educators of some sort. I was wondering if you organized assignments and assessments around that same idea, and if so, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
It's still kind of a work in progress. I'm only actually in my third year of teaching the music history sequence at all. Up in, you know, for the last 17 years, it's just been a preach purgatory. So, you know, the idea of actually thinking about what my students are going to do in the future is something that I'm kind of getting new to. And that's why every semester has had a completely different set of assignments and perspectives. And that is something that I'm in the process of kind of working out and crafting. So I'm writing down everybody's ideas for assignments and ideas and methods of going about things in hopes that I'll find the thing that jumps out.
Hi, Eric Ho. One thing that I was intrigued by is that you talked about changes in pedagogy, but the context of the idea that facts were not easy to come by before the internet didn't come up. And I was wondering what you think of that, and what do you think will become in the future? Because, you know, there are certain things like information literacy, which wasn't so important when there, you know, only textbooks around, right?
Well, this is what I mean by the term externalized knowledge, that nowadays, you know, facts are there, and all that I have to do if I want to find out anything is pull out my cell phone and Google it, and students, of course, have grown up in that culture and have no recollection of the days when that was not the case, and I have no doubt that has had a profound effect on their attitude toward the nature of what they're learning. Anyone else want to address that?
Yeah, at this conference last year, I made the opposite argument of the one I'm making today. I argued that facts were basically irrelevant because you could look up whatever you needed, and so this is sort of my mea culpa. I do think that even with of information that students have today, it remains true that the people with the best facts at their disposal most quickly can win arguments, or can at least make arguments. Maybe winning is not the goal, but it still matters. In other words, that you know, you can have people arguing something and then everybody whips out their phones and tries to resolve it. But the people with the most credibility to begin with, or the most ability to recall those basic facts, are going to be the ones who drive that conversation. And I think that's a value that our students still have, even if they're more and more willing to go elsewhere to get those facts.
Which actually might lead to a different answer to the question about what is a fact. We could simply suggest that a fact is what people remember. So, question in the back?
Hi, I'm Lady Olaf. I'm going to sit down because I feel weird standing up. So, I was struck by a number of you use the terms either what they'll find useful or what they'll need later. I think all of you are mostly talking about teaching either music majors or graduate students where music is going to be their life continuing. And so I don't mean to explode the context in a not useful way, but it made me think about how most of the students I teach, and maybe for some of you this is also the case, they're not going to go on to music at all, and this may even be the only class they learn music history in. And I do teach music appreciation, but also classes on other topics that are basically musicology and music history classes, but to students that are not primarily music students. So the facts are not going to be useful to them later, except for maybe in this joke about the cocktail parties. So the question that I have is basically, is there some kind of other usefulness to sort of liberal arts content acquisition skills that they can then take to their job at Google or Facebook or Twitter or whatever they're going to do in the future as engineers, that having had to learn facts about music history is then a skill for learning about other kinds of information. Like that was sort of where my thoughts were going. I'd be interested to hear feedback.
Can I, this is where I think the idea of metacognition is really important. If you can teach students how they learn as they're learning things, then that's the skill that they take with them rather than the individual facts. So knowing, trying to cram a bunch of information before a test is not the most productive way to learn. Maybe leads them when they get to Google or whatever to space things out a little bit more. And then actually it's also true that the more facility you have with that kind of learning, the easier it gets for you, right? It's a continuing process.
Right, that's sort of where I was headed as well. Like that somehow it being itself a practicable skill to learn information, even if that particular information is not going to be necessary to you 10 years later.
It's like language learning. If you learn one second language, then the third language is easier and the fourth language is easier just because you're learning how to learn that information.
Cool, thanks.
Let me just briefly address that as the author of a music appreciation textbook, because it had always been my feeling with that class that it doesn't serve non-music majors particularly well to leave with their heads full of factual information, that the skill that they need to acquire through that class is how to listen better and to listen better to anything. And I was actually thrilled the first year I taught that class when one of my students told me that after taking the music appreciation class with me, he was listening better to his chemistry lectures. And, okay, back half of the room.
Hi, my name is Catherine Walker, and I also arts context, and so I just the thing that I struggle with my students is they're great students, but they have this bias toward knowledge as text driven, and so teaching them that knowledge can happen in sound, that there is such a thing as a sound fact, is actually very hard to impart on them, and they're more confident and safe in a text driven history and knowledge as words and reading and that sort of thing. So it's really actually incredible to me how far they will go to not do the listening in a way. Like the ways that they make these little schematics to memorize the instrumentation so they don't actually have to know the piece for the listening. It boggles my mind. It's like my 5-year-old brushing her teeth. If I'm not standing there with her, she's got water running, she's holding her toothbrush, but she's not brushing. It's weird. And so, it's not like we're trying to get them to do something horrible. We want them to know this beautiful music. And it's strange to me that the ways that they don't appreciate these sound facts, and that they won't engage with it more deeply. So I make listening exams, and I put my grades on the listening really heavily to try to get them to listening. But I'm wondering if anyone has any strategies that are working for getting these students to listen deeply and meaningfully, and not just stay in the comfortable world of words. Acquisition of knowledge.
Make it a game.
That's interesting, but I struggle also with that. There's a lot of research on the entertainmentization of higher ed, and I struggle with that too, because I remember sitting there in Sally Fuller's history class, just being I had to discipline myself to get this information. I think there's a fine line between having to make everything fun and so
Okay, do you want to respond to that?
Yes, I teach I'm Michael Cooper, I teach at Southwestern University, and liberal arts context as well, right? So, first of all, thank everyone for all of this. But one of the things I try to convey and struggle with a lot is the notion that the facts, however we construe that we're doing in these classes, are things which are supposed to excite, encourage them to dive in deeper and to learn pieces that are not in the anthology, as well as the ones that are in the anthology and things like that. And one thing that I've employed in this context, which is similar to what you mentioned, is I actually have a participation rubric that encourages them to make connections to other disciplines and experiences, and I monetize it. So if they make an explicit connection to something that is completely outside of fine arts, elsewhere in their educational experience, they get 5 points. Elsewhere in the fine arts is 3 points, elsewhere in music is 1 point, and it really actually gives them a lot of agency in terms of what they understand as the significance of what they're learning, and they connect the music to those things as well. I have one student who's very passionate vegan, and he connects everything.
I find that that gets them listening more deeply and not losing as much of the mystery.
Right.
That's what I'm struggling with.
It works very well. And I've been doing it for some years, and I had to tweak it a little bit.
Could I just briefly
Okay.
say something about it? It seems to me like what you're also talking about is getting students to make a personal connection with pieces, because while we do listen to things that people tell us to listen to and listen for the knowledge of being able to discriminate those from other pieces, I think if you think about, at least when I think about my own experience in those classes, it was particular recordings, particular pieces that I had an identification with in some way or other. And you're not going to do that with every piece in the anthology, but if you do that with enough of them, I think that starts to establish that that love. And then the other thing I would say just real quickly is I think modeling listening and discussion of listening in class is really important, because having them listen to the pieces on their own, they do a different kind of listening behavior, not necessarily the one that you would like them to do. So playing a piece back and forth, little sections sometimes, returning to a section, reacting to it yourself, those in the music that just make you go crazy, right? Having done that with students, I think that's when I see them light up a little bit.
Margaret Walker, I'm going to sort of perch here. So I have 2 comments. One is to your question, and is coming back to why the facts, because the students ask that, and I actually had a student say to me, why do you teach us the facts? I guess it's because it's easy to test. So trying to get around that. But the question about engagement, we're talking about listening, like that's the only way to music, as Christopher responded. And every chance I get, I try to have the students do things, sing, clap, play. I teach world music, which sometimes makes it a little easier. I run around with African bells and rattles and things. But even if you're limited to Western classical music, which is a whole other thing when we're talking about music appreciation, that we really about music, we're talking about a certain type. But the more you can get them to do and be engaged, because another interesting thing about our digital world, everybody's got earbuds in all the time, but the music's all background music. And I sometimes get the feeling that my students, the minute you put on music, they go into this mental space where it's background music. But the other thing I wanted to say about the facts, why knowing facts is important, is you can't have a eureka moment if you don't have the facts to connect together. If you have to look everything up and then you look this thing up, you're never going to go up Bloom's taxonomy, so to speak.
I'm John Spilker. Who was the person who asked the original liberal arts question in this? What's your name?
Emily Pollock.
Thank you.
I teach at MIT, actually, so calling it liberal arts is very flattering.
I think in asking, and I love what Rob Robin said about like thinking about like I want them to listen better and how that connects to like whatever job they might have. You know, I think I'm faced with the same thing, in part because I am at a liberal arts institution, but also I think the discipline of music is facing perhaps what history and English addressed at least 20 years ago. What do you do with this degree? Because you're not going to be an Englisher for a career, or a historian for a career, or so I think it's a question that's there for all of us to consider, and I do think it relates a little bit to Bloom's taxonomy, because the more I grapple with it, I'm asking, what do I want them to do with these facts? Because I do believe that they have to have facts. And I was dying to know where Matt Baumer would put me in the sorting hat. Matt Baumer, in all seriousness, I'm like, I wonder where I fit on there, because we have to have facts. And as Anne pointed out, facts are more complex than we think they are. And I do think it's about, what do I want them to be able to do with this information? What skills do I want them to acquire? And I find that having conversations with scientists at my university, and they talk to me about the science initiative that's been going on for the past couple of years to like revamp science education so that it's more active. As I listen to what they say, I ask, how would I take that thing that they're talking about and do it in this classroom? Thank you.
I thought of two more things that we can do with the facts that we learn in music history classroom in response points. One is that I tend not to appreciate this, but critical thinking depends on facts. You can't actually do the thinking that comes with critical thinking unless you're thinking about something in relation to something else or in comparison to something else. So that's, I tell students that too, that, you know, yes, it seems really abstract and esoteric right now. Next year in an upper level class, you're going to realize that you can put 2 and 2 together and get 4, and then 10 years from now, you're going to put something from music together with something from some other discipline and just like realize that college was worth it. It's going to take 10 years, but you'll get there. And then the second thing is that if we focus heavily on facts, in part it teaches students that there are facts to know about music, and not just maybe the music we teach, but if we do a good job, it shows them there are facts to know about any music that they might choose to use as background music, but they might not. And one of the points that I make is that yes, while we privilege composers, while we privilege the Western canon in my classes for the most part, I am teaching them transferable skills so that when they are listening to Beyonce or Drake, they should be able to ask critical questions of it and know that there are facts behind that music's creation, performance, reception that are worth knowing, and that they can also use. So again, like last year, I was saying that like facts are worthless and we should just focus on critical thinking, and I've done a complete 180. But I will now defend facts, whatever we think of them, to the death. So,
Okay, I think maybe we have time for one more question.
Hi, Christopher Wells. I just wanted to reflect on, I think part of the point of what's useful for students to do with facts, and also how to get students interested in them, is I think it's helpful to think about the ways that the facts of music historical context connect with and find resonance with things that students are thinking about in their own lives. For me, in my context, I teach at a large school of music. Most of the students I teach are working musicians themselves. So the reason that I've come to focus more on facts since coming to that school is not because I think it's necessarily critical that musicians know music historical facts for knowing those sake, but because they connect their own lives as working musicians with the lives of working musicians past and present. The one example I'll throw out is in a class on music in New Orleans, and in some cases I find that popular music is sort of more of an uncomfortably unfamiliar context for music school than it was when I was teaching it principally to non-majors. That when I was talking about a passage from Matt Sakakini's book on brass bands, where he talks about brass bands being frustrated with social aid and pleasure clubs figuring out their catering and all of that, and only thinking about the music last, even though it's the thing that's driving the party. The collaborative pianist in the room really connected with that in terms of how they felt other students were thinking about their recitals, and it started this whole sort of beautiful connection to their own context that I hadn't thought of. So the one idea I'll put up there is that the more I get to know my students and the more I get to know the things that they're actively thinking about in their lives, and not to get too much into contemporary politics, but a lot of students wanted to talk about Soviet composers and what it means to compose in an ideologically repressive space this semester, notably more so in the past. So I think the more we can listen to what students are thinking about, the issues that are challenging in their own lives, and think about facts as things that get connected that way, the more success I've had getting them to care and getting them to drive the ways in which these facts are meaningful and decide what to do with them.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Fascinating discussion. We can perhaps continue the discussion during the 15-minute break.
We have about 10 minutes to break.
Okay.
So.
Well, sorry about that.
No, that's okay. I'm just, reminding everyone, and then
Ever shortening break.
Right.
Thank you, Robin. That was really a nice context you put around it.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciated your feedback. I laughed out loud a lot of times when I read what you had to say, which is good, because the way that you put it.